welcome back. Today we're going to be covering how to clay up a prosthetic to be able to mold it. The reason I'm doing this as a separate video is because I'm going to be doing videos covering a lot of different techniques for molding. So we'll do for different materials. So we'll be doing one with syntactic dough and epoxy systems, we'll be doing one with BJB 1630, we'll be doing one with UltraCal 30. And so I don't want to have to go through this same process every single time on those videos. So I figure it's pretty much exactly the same process no matter what you're molding the material out of, with one or two exceptions, which is more to do with what you're going to be casting the prosthetic in. So if it's a silicone prosthetic or a foam prosthetic, there are slight alterations that you would make to what we're doing, and I'll talk about those as we're doing it. But as far as the exterior of the mold, it's pretty much exactly the same process. So I figure if I do one video on this, then all of the others will just start with the prosthetic already clayed in, and it will save some time, and that'll be fine. So a couple of things we need to talk about first to cover before we get into actually claying it out. Today we're going to be claying up this fella here. So I'll be showing you guys how to do that. We're going to be creating the cutoff, and we're going to be, brain fart. We're going to be creating the cutting edge and the runoff. We're going to be putting some keys in and some touch points, and I'll explain each of those along the way as we go. But firstly, let's look at what we're looking to create. So this is a mold. It's for foam latex. It's made out of fiberglass, epoxy and syntactic dough. I'm going to be doing a video on how to create these molds. They're very lightweight, they're very durable, they last for many runs. If you make them out of UltraCal, you'll probably get a good 20 to 30 quality runs, and then the surface will start to deteriorate. This stuff here doesn't really deteriorate. I've got some molds that I've been running hundreds of times. I've never had a problem with them. They just run and run and run, and they're fantastic. Quite a bit more expensive than an UltraCal mold, but the quality is far superior and worth the investment if you're going to be using it as a production mold and running multiple pieces. So this is just a two-part mold. So it comprises of the core, which is, you know, the equivalent of what this is. And I know that we made a video on how to create these, and so that's good. This one is also 1630. That's what I typically make all of my cores out of for my production molds. It doesn't need mold release for foam latex, which is a huge plus for me, and it holds up really well. This is a corrected life cast, so you notice that there's no undercuts anywhere. I'll be doing a video on how to do a corrected life cast for creating a core. This one here, because it's for a Grinch, this is a Grinch mold. It has the ball on the nose here to create the air passages so they can breathe. There's no undercuts, everything is ready. So that's the Grinch core. And what we're going to be creating today is this. So if you look here, you'll see that there's this sort of recessed area here, and there's this edge right along the edge of the sculpt. This edge here is called the cutting edge. It's what pinches off your material to create that very fine membrane-like edge, which blends it seamlessly into skin. If you have a bad cutting edge, you'll get a bad edge on your prosthetic. It's very important that your cutting edge is good. So we'll be talking about what goes into making a good cutting edge and how to achieve that. And then all the rest of this area that's recessed is called the runoff. It's where all of the excess material that's in here that isn't part of the prosthetic gets evacuated out of the mold, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. These little semicircle pieces, they're called touch points. So that just means that it's where the core touches the mold here, so all the stress isn't necessarily on the cutting edge, and it also helps to center the mold. The other option that you have is keys. This doesn't have any keys in it, but I'll show you guys how to put some keys in. It's fairly simple, and then they help it lock in, the positive lock into the negative, and helps it seat itself properly, and it can help with, you know, aligning the mold, especially in molds where maybe it's kind of a, if it's something for the top of the head and it's just rounded and there's no real sort of angles that can really lock it in, it can slide around a bit. You're going to want to have some keys so that when it hits those keys it doesn't move at all. So you'll also notice that this is a very even width of thickness all the way through, which is very important, especially if you're going to be baking foam in it. You want the inside and the outside to roughly be the same and very even, and that way your foam will bake evenly. The heat will be able to penetrate through here, it'll be able to penetrate through the core and bake your foam at an even pace, which is great. It's also better for stability and strength of the mold. So I'll show you how to create this nice even edge. And the third thing that we need, the last thing we need to discuss is, if you look at the mold on the side, you'll notice that the core is slightly raised from the actual top of the mold. That's intentional. You don't really want to have it flush. If you have it flush, it's harder to strap the mold down. Right now, if I was to take a bit of wood and put it across like that, you see there's this little gap. And then we'll put the mold strap on, it'll push down, and that way it's really only pushing on the core. It's not pushing on the mold. So when we put the pressure down, it's pushing the core only down. If it was even, if it was flush with this, put a board there, it's going to be pushing on the top of the mold, and you're not really going to get that same pressure on on the core, which is going to create a better edge. So we definitely want to have that, you know, raised. Sometimes it ends up bigger, sometimes it ends up smaller, but as long as you put a bit of wood on here and there's nowhere that the wood touches the top of the mold, we're going to be okay. So I'll show you how to do that as well in this video. We're not going to actually mold it on this video, I'll show you that later. As I said, I'm going to do videos on different molding materials, but the laying up of the prosthetic is always the same. So let's get started. So the things that we're going to need here, I've got a fresh bag of water clay. This is actually wet clay, but you can use regular water clay if you don't have access to wet. I've got a clay board here. I've got some oil clay here. This is, I think it's called GMAC clay. It's a very soft oil-based clay. It's what I use to sculpt these particular prosthetics out of. It's a lot softer than Chavant, but I can access it here, and it's, you know, fairly affordable. You can use clean clay for what we're going to be using this for. It's a very popular alternative to do your cutting edge. And I've got some knives. This is just a regular palette knife that I ground down into a point. It's good for cutting clay and doing detailing along the edge. I've got this particular little tool here, which is great for sealing off your edges of your cutting edge. I've got this number 7 wax spatula, which I just kind of bent the edges a little bit to be able to provide access into areas that I couldn't get before. And I've got a couple of different varieties of sticks, paint sticks and whatnot. I'm going to be using this one today. I'm not going to be using this one. This one I use for when I'm doing full head, because that's going to create the even thickness around the outside of the mold. I always like to have a clay board because you can keep it nice and clean. The table often gets covered in schmutz and stuff and powder, and it can jack up your clay. So here's our sculpt. You can see that it's got the blending edge. It's all been blended off pretty nicely. There's not really many problems with that. We've got a blending edge around the eyes. We've got a blending edge around the outside of the face. We've got a blending edge in the lips. There's not really a blending edge in the nostrils. If the prosthetic was running right to the edge of the actual nostrils and you would see the actor's actual nostrils, I would put a little cutting edge in there. But because this is pretty much, you're not going to see it, I'm not going to bother with that. This will just create its own little thing. And then what we can do later if we want is we can get a little round Dremel bit and we just Dremel a little hole on the inside of the mold if we want to make a receiver for it. But I seldom bother with that. So we've got cutting edge. Anywhere there's the blending edge, you'll need to create a cutting edge. So let's get started with that. So I'm going to make a snake of our oil clay or clean clay, whichever you like to use. I've used Chavant for it. I've used, sometimes I just use water clay for all of it, mostly because I'm lazy. It's not a commonly done practice, so I don't want to teach you that necessarily here. Although when we go into our molding videos, you'll probably see that some of the molds will have a cutting edge created out of water-based clay. So that's just a personal choice of mine for speed. Okay, so we're going to roll this into a snake. We want to try and keep it as even as possible. And then we're going to run this right around the edge. Oh, I forgot one step. Alright, so because I like to finish down a lot of my sculpts with baby powder, it makes it very, I guess, not sticky for the clay to stick to it. So what I like to do also is to just seal the whole thing with some crystal clear. I'm using the matte finish just because otherwise it's going to be really shiny and your print coat can bead off. Now it's very important when you're applying this that you don't just drown it in crystal clear. You've got to imagine that everything that you add to this is going to add space. So when we mold this, if you've had a large build up here or up here of crystal clear, it's going to create like a space. When we pull the negative mold off and clean out the mold, anywhere where there was any material at all, be it clay, be it crystal clear, be it mold release, is going to create a little bit of a gap. And the more gap there is, the worse your blending edge is going to be on your prosthetic. So you want to try and keep it as light as possible. A very light spray like that is fine. It's not going to really build up that much. Some people, what they'll do is they'll put this on, they'll put the mold release on, and then they'll take a acetone on a little Q-tip and they'll run it around the very edge of everything. I don't bother doing that. I don't find that it makes all that much difference, but you know, that's just my personal choice. So we've got our snake here, and we're basically going to take it and we're going to press it, and you can see how close that is to the clay, to the sculpt. Okay, we want to keep it as close as we can to the sculpt without touching the clay. If the clay ends up touching the sculpt at any point, that's going to blow your blending edge. The foam's going to be able to flow out of there. It's going to have a thick edge. So we don't want it to actually touch, but we want it to be as close as we can without actually touching the clay sculpt. And you have to be really careful, because at this point, if you jack your sculpt up, it's going to be a little trickier to fix it, because we've got a layer of acrylic spray over the whole thing. Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to jump ahead, and I'm going to put the same thing all the way around the edge. I'm going to put a snake around here and a snake around both of the eyes, just to save just time on the video. I'll just do that and I'll come back when it's finished. So now you can see that we've got our little snake running all the way around the whole entire circumference of every blending edge, and now I'm just going to kind of smooth out all the lumps and bumps that we made with our fingers pushing it all on, because we don't really want to have it sort of, you know, lumpy like that. Just be careful that you don't push it down so far that it goes over into your sculpt, because that'll cause problems for your sculpt that you're going to have to fix later. Okay, so I'm going to call that smooth. Next step we're going to do is we're going to create our cutting edge. Now, it's really important that when you do it on a 45-degree bevel. Okay. And you've got to be really careful not to ding your sculpt when you're doing this. Now the reason that we do it on a 45 is that it provides a stronger cutting edge on our mold. When you get down to here, because if you leave it on the board, you're not going to have room. So you want to make sure you do all of this before you kind of fix the core to the board with some clay. Okay, so you can see I've got a nice even amount of the core showing, and it's not too much. If this was going to be for a maybe like an encapsulated silicone piece, you maybe want to leave just a little bit, maybe half of that again, just so that when they go in to dissolve the encapsulant, it doesn't come up into the silicone part. You've still got plenty of room to dissolve it and still have what we would normally have, what's showing here, left to keep the encapsulant containing the silicone. Otherwise it can run into problems with application and coloring, because silicone doesn't take paint the same as the encapsulant material does. Now bear in mind, because we're doing this on the angle, don't try and do it from here and actually ding your sculpt. Make sure you're doing it so that it's hitting your core. It'll take a little practice, but whoops, I just dinged my sculpt right then. So you can see the tool slipped, so I'm just going to have to blend that off and just get my, oops, I'm just going to use a quick little texture stamp just to add a little texture there. Saw a couple of other little bits that I'd missed earlier. You can still use your texture stamp after the acrylic because it's just pushing texture and you're not actually breaking the surface of it, so it doesn't really affect it that much. Okay. Are we all done? No, we've still got a tiny little bit here to go. Now, what we have to do is we have to look at the whole edge of our cutting edge to make sure there's no tiny little gaps. Okay, down here, that's looking a little messed up. So I'm just gonna, you can see right in here, there's that little gap there. I'm just gonna carefully smooth that down. Make sure that this smooths out. We don't really want to have lots of jagged stuff. And we're also going to go ahead and just remove that little portion of stuff there. Okay. Okay, there we go. Back in focus. So it looks like it's pretty well. There's a little bit of residue there that we can remove. Let's have a look in here at these. Now these got a little jagged, so we want to just kind of round these off as best we can. You can see there's a tiny little gap there. I'll make sure that that's right against the clay. I mean, right against the core. And where are we? There we are. That one's all good. This one here, there's a tiny little spot down in here where you can see a little gap between the clay and the core. So I'm just going to make sure that that's pushed all the way down. Round this corner here off. It's sort of awkward to do with one hand holding the camera, so I apologize if it's a little shaky. Just check the rest of this. Definitely want to fix this bit here. Just clean off the tool. Okay, so that looks like it's good to go. With our cutting edge is inspected and fixed, and just make sure that we do the lip. That all looks fine. So putting in keys. So what we're going to do. Normally, you want to have 3 keys or 5 keys, depending on how it is. Today I'm going to be putting 3, and usually you want to have them as much of an equilateral triangle as you can. Obviously I'm not going to be able to do this because it's a really long thing, so I'm going to put one here, I'm going to put one here, and I'm going to put one up here. Now we need to be careful of undercuts. because if we're putting keys in this way and we're putting keys in that way, then those keys are going to lock in and you're not going to be able to remove it from the core. So I'm going to make sure that these keys come straight down in. This one here is going to go in on an angle, and then we're going to put a little bit of clay in here to avoid that undercut. Now to put the keys in, I'm just going to use a router bit. They come in various sizes, and because we're working with a finished sculpt that's already been sealed, you're going to need to be really careful, because it is really easy for this to go zing up through your sculpt. It's happened to me a few times when I started. It's not so bad down here, because I can, you know, sort of push it into that corner and then make sure that try not to get any of the shavings into your sculpt. Okay, so we've got one key. You can see that this spinning chuck here kind of zinged my cutting edge there, so I just need to fix that. Now normally you probably want to just think about where your sculpt's going to be and then put your keys in first. It solves this whole problem of jacking up your sculpt. Sometimes I'm not really sure where I'm going to be doing it, so I put my keys in afterwards. Now because this one's basically putting a key into a convex rounded thing, it's really easy because it's spinning and it's going to want to do something that we can't control. So I'm just going to take a drill bit and I'm just going to just put the tiniest little divot there, something for our round router bit to be able to just sit in so that it doesn't just, and the more vertical you can get your bit, the less chance you have of an undercut. So you can see here that has a very, very tiny lip here where it goes in underneath and then goes into our key. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a tiny bit of that water clay that we had earlier and just going to make a little thing, and I'm just going to basically just fill that little undercut bit in. So now it's not an issue, and I'll just, oops, just going to need to spray that to seal it. This stuff doesn't like having clay stick to the freshly ground out stuff. It's a little powdery. I'm just going to kind of smooth down. So you can see how all that tool marker's left a sort of little raised ridge. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm just going to kind of slightly soften that, get rid of all of the very pointy edge. What you want to do, especially if you're going to be doing this for foam latex, is you want to have everything as smooth and as nice as possible. That way you don't run the risk of your foam getting caught in the mold and tearing your piece. So you want everything to be nice and smooth and clean. Okay, so that should be dry enough now for us to get our clay again, shove it in there. Okay, so all we're basically wanting to do is to get rid of that little undercut lip with something soft that isn't going to lock the mold in. So we want to leave as much of it as we can free. Okay, so there we go. So now if you look down, straight down onto the thing, you can see all of the surface of everything. That's how you can tell if you're going to have an undercut problem. Is if you look down on it and you can see the entire surface of everything you're going to mold, then you know there's no undercuts. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we do the tutorial on correcting a life cast, because that's where we really focus on undercuts, because we're trying to get rid of all possible undercuts on our core. So now it's ready to add our runoff. Alright, so adding the runoff to our sculpt. So adding the runoff to our sculpt. So I've got my clay cutting board here, just to keep the clay nice and clean. I always like to use a fresh block rather than one that's made up of scraps. I'll use the scraps for sculpting. You know, any offcuts I'll put them into, you can see over here on my table, you can see there's many bags of clay, and a lot of them are kind of lumpy, and that's just because as I cut off things, I'll move all of the usable scraps to one side and then shove them all in a bag. And they're fine for sculpting if you're grabbing handfuls and just pounding it onto a sculpt. But when I'm going to mold, I like having this as even and as nice and pretty as possible, because it makes for nicer pieces. So this is going to be probably about 1/8 of an inch thick. You don't want to have your runoff too thick. Reason being is that it can cause problems with filling your mold. You have a lot of waste, so we want to make sure that it's thick enough that we can evacuate the mold fairly evenly, but still thin enough that it doesn't take a lot of material to fill it all the way up, especially if it's a full-faced mold. You're going to want to have it not quite so thick. I've seen some people, and they do their runoff, you know, like 1/4 inch thick to a 1/2 inch thick, and it takes so much to fill the runoff to be able to get the foam filled to the top of the sculpt that they end up losing a lot of foam. So we're just going to basically cut this into little strips, and we're going to run it all the way around. Yeah. You can just kind of scooch it into all the little crevices and gaps and stuff all the way along. Now after we do this step and the next step, we're not going to be able to remove the core off the board, because the core is going to be kind of clayed to the molding board. So anything that you need to do with your cutting edge around here, you're going to want to do it before you start this particular step. And you want to be careful that you don't cover your keys and lose where they are. So I'll show you what I do with the keys. This one here I've got to be a little bit more careful with, because we actually have that little bit of clay there which we don't want to lose. So I might be like a little extra careful with that, just because I don't want to create an undercut. Although even if we didn't fix that undercut, these will pull straight out, so it'll just mean that the core comes out this way. But it's better not to have any undercuts if you can actually help it. So we'll do it the proper way. You want to make sure you don't get any of this water clay coming over the edge of your cutting edge, because that'll just make it rough and uneven, and problematic. A lot of people like to wear gloves when they're working with the wet clay, and quite often I do too, because it dries my skin out a lot, but I might do it later, or maybe not at all. Okay, got just one little bit down here. I got some mess here where it came over the edge. Everything else looks good. So now we can go with larger pieces just to kind of... You can see here we've kind of lost our keys. I know I can feel that one there, so I'm just going to put a little dent there. And then I can feel this one here, so I'm just going to put a little dent there. And then that'll let us know where those keys are, so that when we come back we can just extract the clay out of them. This one here, however, I want to be a little bit more careful with. I don't want to lose that one altogether, because I don't want to have to dig into the clay and maybe extract this little piece here. So I'm going to let me take that all the way down to the board. You can just kind of guesstimate the shapes just to fill them in. kind of like playing a game of Tetris, but where you're able to cut the pieces yourself. Sort of fit it all in together. Add a little extra down here, just because that goes down on an angle where we flattened it for standing on the sculpting stand. I don't want to have an undercut happen here, so I'm just going to make sure that this comes out too. It'll make a little bit of a wider portion in our mold, but that doesn't matter. Just don't want to have it create an undercut. So you can see that we're bringing that to, at the very least, even, but I'm going to even go a little bit further and kind of angle it out like that. Okay. So now we're going to use this particular kidney. It needs a little bit of a clean off. You see how it's got this this right angle right here. That's what we're wanting to just kind of carefully run around the edge here, just to try and give it as clean of a transition into the board as possible. Okay, and now we're going to create that spacer. You know how we're talking about how the core is slightly raised out from the mold. Let's just extract this first. So we've got our keys where we marked them with the dent, and we're going to bevel them so that we don't want to take a tube straight up out of it. We want to make sure that it continues the same angle. So the base of the key should be much wider than where it goes into the thing. That way it makes for a strong key. So I bevel them quite wide usually, just to create a strong key that's not going to snap when we crank on it. Now this one here is a little different because we've got that clay in there, so we're just going to kind of continue that clay, the angle from that clay. Okay. So that's enough to sort of touch it and lock it in sideways. If we hadn't had the clay, it would lock it in this way, and then it would be not necessarily easy to pull it off. So that's all going to work fine. So put the next bit down, which is going to create the degree in which our mold is raised, core is raised out of our mold. So however thick we cut this next bit of clay will determine the thickness of that raised, sort of recessed edge of the mold. So, I mean, we could do it the same as this, and it would give it this much of a raise. I'm probably going to go just a little bit more. Just obviously, the more that you raise it, you can save a little bit of materials. Okay, so we'll raise it up to about, I guess, that. So if you look at this, we can go at anywhere up to probably an inch high with that, how much it's raised. So we can probably go even a little more. In fact, yeah, that should be good, and that'll raise it up that much out of the mold. You can see the thickness of that when we cut our clay. Okay, so that's going to be how much our mold sticks, the core sticks out from the mold. Now, if you don't have one of these nifty clay cutters, I'll do a tutorial, like just a mini tutorial on how to create your own clay cutting board, which will have multiple thicknesses available to you, and then you'll sort of be set into whatever, locked into whatever those set thicknesses are. So I'm going to use this. So this here is going to be the width of our mold here. So when we were looking at our mold, where did I put it? Okay, look at this. This here is actually the same thickness as the paint stick. Oh, there we go. That's because I always use this particular sort of gallon paint stick to create that thickness. So what we're going to do is cut the crusts off this. Let me just... I'm going to cut the crusts off our clay, and then all these offcuts I just shove over here, and I put them in a bag so that we can save them. No need to waste them. So we want all of our edges to be as clean as possible, and then we're going to take these and we're going to run them around as close to the clay as we can. Now, careful not to push them down with your thumb, because this stuff's really, really soft. And when you're joining two pieces, if it's on a curve, leave that gap open. If you try and smush it in, you're going to jack it up. So you're better off just leaving it. And we'll come in and just place a little piece in there. Okay, so this looks like we're probably going to have to cut another slab. I don't think that these other two pieces are going to give us enough to make it all the way around. Nope. If I had one more of these things, it would have been perfect, but oh well. Just gonna sort of mush that, kind of stick them together. Smooth it out. We'll take this and just run the paint stick around, and you can see that that just kind of pinches it all in together and makes it nice. cut another slice. And I think I'm only going to need one more. Piece here, and we'll here, and then just trim that. And then we just make some small little triangles. We're just going to fill these little things in, and that way we're not running the risk of them coming apart from wanting to pull apart. Especially if you're using material like the epoxy and syntactic dough, where it takes a little while to cure, the clay will start to dry out and want to separate, and if it's pulling against itself, then it's definitely going to be a problem. So anywhere where there's a join, you want to kind of mush the clay together. Try not to do it so you totally destroy the nice even edge you've got. And if you find you get a little divot like that, you've got some scraps here, you can just grab a little bit and just pop it on there. Okay, now we're just going to take this and kind of make sure there's no, you don't want to have any gap between this thing we've got going around the outside and the clay on the runoff. So I just kind of use the stick to kind of pinch that into there. And I run this around like that to make sure it's not sort of push the stick in this way, to make sure it's all nice and even. Okay, we're almost done. Now we're just going to get some water on a damp sponge. Where are we? Some water on a damp sponge, and we're just going to kind of gently smooth out all of this. Can also use a brush if you have a soft brush, that will work as well. But you want to try and get every little part that could have your material get trapped in it. You don't want to have anything rough at all. You want everything need to be smoothed down very, very well. And again, just be really mindful of your sculpt. Make sure that you're not rubbing some dirty clay sponge accidentally up against it, because that'll wreck some of your texture on your sculpt that you spend all that time sculpting, or should have spent all that time sculpting. If you're being lazy and you're not texturing your sculpt properly, or it may add more texture, but of course we all have spent time doing nice skin texture on our prosthetic sculpts. Now we're almost done. But I do want to put a couple of little touch points in, just because we've got our 3 keys there. I don't want to give it room to be able to rock, so I'm going to take my knife, and I'm going to just put a little one here, and then I'm going to do a beveled semicircle here, and then carefully extract that clay. Now sometimes the clay will come out easily. Obviously this time it's decided it's not going to cooperate with me, but that's okay because I get to show you what to do when it doesn't. So then it's just a matter of carefully just removing it. Okay, then we'll do the same on the other side. That one decided it was going to behave a little better. Now some people will do their whole runoff out of oil clay. I don't see the point in that. I think it's just a waste of clay and a lot more effort than needs to happen. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that that clay is all done, and just make sure there's no little dents and holes. Check our cutting edge one last time to make sure there's no nastiness in there. And the last step that we do is coating of crystal clear. And again, we're not wanting to build up a lot of thickness in these keys and touch points, but we do want to be able to seal the clay so that it doesn't move around and dirty our print coat or our mould. So most of this should be targeted on the water clay. We've already sealed this one with a light spray earlier, if you remember. Now anytime you're using this, it should always be psh, 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 never psh, because then you get puddling and runs and it's not good. Okay, and once that all dries, which should only take a couple minutes, I'm just going to hit it with a quick light coating of our Ease Release 200. Okay. That is pretty much dry now. Again, I'm focusing mainly on the clay at that point, and now I'm just going to hit our areas of exposed core, because the last thing you want is for your cutting edge to stick to the mold, because then it'll destroy everything. And then make sure we get it into those holes, and then a quick light application on the sculpt. Okay, now we're ready to begin with our molding with our print coat.